Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at our Watershed Wednesdays program, sponsored by Clay Subaru of Norwood, Mass. My name is Declan Devine. I'm the Environmental Science Fellow for the Neponset River Watershed Association, and I will be your moderator today. Today's presenter will be Chris Hirsch, and he will be talking about the native trout of the Neponset Watershed. Chris is the environmental scientist for NepRWA, and he has been working in the watershed since 2016. So without further ado, take it away, Chris.
Let me share my screen really fast. Can everybody see the slides?
Good.
Excellent. So thank you, Declan, for the wonderful introduction. I'm Chris Hirsch. I'm the environmental scientist with Neponset River Watershed Association. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to be talking today about our Neponset Native Trout Initiative, which is our efforts and plans to protect the native brook trout that call the Neponset River Watershed home. So first, we'll start with the basics. What is a brook trout? So it's not actually a trout, which a lot of people are surprised to find out. Brook trout are actually a type of char, so they're much more related to, say, an Arctic char than they are to a brown trout. But if we called it the Neponset Native Char Initiative, people probably would have no idea what we're talking about. So we stuck with the name trout. Eastern brook trout are native to New England, this area, and their range extends down the Appalachian Mountains all the way to Georgia. And then there's another cluster of native brook trout around the driftless area in Wisconsin and in Michigan. But today we're going to be focusing mainly on the eastern seaboard populations. Brook trout are typically found in cold freshwater streams, especially in high elevation areas on the Appalachian Mountains. But there are some interesting rare coastal populations, especially along the coast of New England, where they actually travel out into the ocean as adults and then come back into the stream to spawn, something similar to salmon on the West Coast. So there's a lot of different reasons why people care about brook trout. Why are we focusing on brook trout for this initiative? Culturally, humans and brook trout, people in brook trout have had a very long history in New England. Thousands of years before European settlers arrived, Native Americans were fishing brook trout. They were a regular staple in the Native American diet, and they actually used scraps and carcasses in their agriculture, which is a practice that they taught to the early colonists when they arrived. Fast forward, more recently in the 1800s, fishing as a pastime and hobby really started to take hold, and in New England was actually a destination. People came from all over the country, in mostly upper class, rich people, but they did come to New England for the chance to catch a native brook trout. Brook trout were really the first New England sport fish, which leads me to economics. So today, the fly fishing is a very popular hobby. It generates over $750 million in the US. And fly fishing is the primary way that people fish for trout. And recreational fishing generally supports hundreds of thousands of jobs in the US. It's not to say that our small streams in the Neponset watershed are major recreational destinations, but to more broadly say that there's a lot of people out there that care a lot about trout and would be very upset and disappointed if trout were to disappear and they could no longer enjoy their hobbies and pastimes. So for me personally, as an environmental scientist, trout mean the most to me for their ecological role. So the trout are apex predators in the systems that they live in, and that means that they play a very important role in maintaining balance among the primary producers, which are the vegetation and small insects, and the primary consumers, smaller fish and insects that live in the streams. And also, really importantly, people often refer to brook trout as canaries in the coal mine, which means, that refers back to the olden days when miners used to bring down canaries in cages to detect, odorless gases like carbon monoxide that might be poisonous and harmful or deadly even to the miners, as an early detection warning system. If the canary croaked, it's probably time to get the heck out of the cave or the mine. And it's very similar in this situation with brook trout. Once you have a system where trout once were and they begin to disappear, that something is wrong with that system. And unfortunately, that's something that we've been seeing across the range. So if you look at this map here, this is the historical range of brook trout in the eastern United States. And you can see in many of the areas, you have great reductions in population sizes. This is largely due to a number of different reasons, which I'm going to talk about. That's going to be the bulk of the talk today. And then we'll be talking about some of the things that NepRWA is doing, NepRWA and partners are doing to kind of combat those issues and kind of make better systems, more sustainable systems. So if you look specifically at Massachusetts and the area around Boston, you'll see that it's mostly gray and some red. Gray indicating that those populations have been extirpated, which just means that they've disappeared, that the streams that used to have brook trout no longer do. And then around the outskirts of that extirpated area are greatly reduced populations based on historical records. So if we zoom in on Massachusetts, based on the map you just saw, probably not surprising to see that most brook trout are found in western Massachusetts. This map is the records of all recorded brook trout populations from the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife's records. The size of the dot indicates the size of the population. So if you have a larger dot, you have a larger population. And if you look over on the right in that circle, that's the Neponset Watershed. And you might notice that it's kind of has a high concentration of populations, more so than you would expect to see in other areas in eastern Massachusetts, especially around Boston. This is something that we're really proud of as being stewards of the Neponset Watershed. Is something that we're really focused on keeping that way. So if we zoom in again, just on the Neponset Watershed, you see this is where the trout are distributed throughout the watershed. So there's 9 streams that have native brook trout populations. The largest populations, our best trout streams, are in Pine Tree Brook, Upper Pine Tree Brook. I saw Will Gregg as a guest. Shout out to him. Many of them are on his property. So that's the green watershed towards the top of the screen. The yellow watershed, kind of in the middle there, is Trap Hole Brook. That's probably the most robust population in the watershed. And then Upper Beaver Brook in Sharon, just below Trap Hole Brook. Those are our 3 best trout streams, but there are marginal populations in 5 other streams in the watershed. So most of what I'm going to be talking about today is the reasons why brook trout are declining in Massachusetts, in our watershed, and across the entire range. And those major reasons are climate change, in-stream barriers like dams and culverts, habitat degradation due to development and deforestation, and water withdrawals and unsustainable uses of water. So first is climate change, and this is kind of the overarching scene. This sets the scene. This is the context in which we're working, because if you're trying to save a species and you're trying to save a system, the systems that support that species, you really need to be looking at what are the future conditions going to be. You can't just work towards the current systems. And while this program is focused on brook trout, really what we're doing is working on the systems that support those trout, those cold water streams that have conditions that are conducive to trout, because if we can get them healthy enough that they can sustain sensitive species like trout, they'll also be healthy for every other species that's in there. So we're not only focused on trout. While they're kind of the mascot and the leading cause for us to do this work, they're not the only beneficiaries of what we're doing. And so when we look at trout and kind of what sorts of impacts or what sorts of conditions they need, I should say, they really need fresh, clean, very cold, oxygen-rich water. And climate change, it poses a very big challenge, quite frankly, for that. If you look on the left, there's a graph with projected number of days over 90 that they're projecting through the end of the century under low and high emission scenarios. And in the little box, you can see that under the high emission scenarios, we're talking about potentially having almost a month worth of days over 100 in the summer by the end of the century. For a species that's very dependent on cold water, that's very challenging. And so that's what we're trying to, set them up to have a fighting chance against. We all need to be pushing and doing our part to push towards the lower emission scenario to avoid that kind of catastrophic system, or catastrophic effects, but it's a reality and a real possibility that could be the climate in New England at the end of the century. And the other thing that trout really need, if you look on the left side, is they need water, quite frankly. They need fresh groundwater. That's where the very cold water is coming from, groundwater sources. And when we have droughts like we have currently, that really puts a lot of strain on them, and especially on some of the smaller streams, those streams begin to dry up, and the fish are really confined to small areas that may not be ideal. So that's another thing that they're predicting to increase. So climate scientists are predicting an increase in the number and intensity of droughts moving forward. Another major challenge for trout and a reason for their decline has been the proliferation of in-stream barriers like dams and poorly designed culverts. These barriers act sort of like a one-way street, if you will. A fish could go downstream over the dam, but they're not going to be able to go back upstream. And that can have several different consequences. For one, if the downstream area is degraded or doesn't have the sorts of areas that fish need to hide out when it's really hot in the summer, those fish could potentially die. Or if they don't have appropriate groundwater seeps that trout rely on for reproduction, while the adults may live, they may not be able to reproduce, and over time that population will disappear. So it's really important to reconnect those areas if the fish are going to have a fighting chance. In addition to that, dams often create warming effects. So if you think about the water that's coming over the dam, it's primarily the water from the surface of the pond. And most ponds don't have a lot of shade over the middle of the pond. That water is very slow moving, so it heats up in the summer, and then that hot water is continually discharged and can actually be detected for quite a distance depending on the size of the pond upstream. In addition to that, more to the point of not having the correct substrate for reproduction, trout rely on a very gravelly, sort of rocky substrate with groundwater seeps to build their nests called redds. And dams disrupt that kind of natural movement of sediment and distribution throughout the stream, and can cause a degradation of potential habitat downstream and upstream of them. So what are we doing about it? Well, we're removing dams. We're reconnecting those streams. We've had a dam removal program for several years now. So far, we've removed 3 dams. You can see those in the upper right and the lower, lower left. Those were on Pine Tree Brook and the Harlings Mill Dam on Pine Tree Brook and Trap Hole Brook at the Siemens property. And we have 2 more projects that we're working on currently, which you can see in the upper left and the lower right, which are the Mill Pond in Trap Hole Brook and Pine Tree Brook at Canton Street. We're hoping that both of those dams will be removed in 2021, and we'll be able to continue to move on to the next dam in line, which we're currently looking for opportunities in the Purgatory Brook watershed and Ponkapog Brook watersheds. And it's not just dams that can be barriers. As I mentioned, culverts can be problems too. So last summer, we went with a handful of volunteers. I saw John Monahan was on, shout out to him. He helped a lot with this culvert evaluation project. And we also worked with partners at Trout Unlimited. We used what's called the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Collaborative method to assess all of the culverts and road crossings on our trout streams in the watershed. And you can see a map of the kind of distribution of where the different barriers are. And the good news is there were only 3 significant barriers or culverts that scored as significant barriers in the watershed, which means, it's not pervasive and a massive problem, but there are issues that need to be resolved to really help the trout along. And the vast majority of barriers were actually minor or insignificant, which was something we were very happy to see. But, as I mentioned, there are problem barriers, there are problem culverts, and we have a culvert replacement program that we're just starting up. We're hopefully going to be removing our first culvert, or not removing, but replacing our first culvert, what you see over on the right side. That's High Plains Street in Sharon. It's kind of hard to see in the picture, but you can see that the stream is more than twice as wide as the opening of the culvert, which really accelerates water through that culvert and makes it difficult for fish to swim upstream. But you could also notice that the head wall of that is leaning pretty severely and looks like it could collapse any day now. So it's really a priority for the town to replace a piece of vulnerable infrastructure, and then a win-win for the fish as well, because we'll be replacing it with a structure that's much larger, that is much more friendly, wildlife friendly, and to reconnect some of those areas, the headwaters of Trap Hole Brook. Another issue that the trout are facing is habitat degradation. This comes in a number of different ways. Turning a natural landscape into a developed landscape with roads and parking lots and shopping centers and houses is going to have its impact on streams, certainly, but also just the removal of trees and the removal of shade that was once over the water has really led to a lot of our streams getting too hot. And if we want to give the trout a fighting chance in the context of, potentially having over 20 days over 100 degrees, we really need to start thinking about how are we going to put shade back on that water. In addition to that, stormwater discharges. So trout need really high quality, clean water to survive. They're visual hunters. So if the water is really cloudy or has a lot of algae in it, that can really impact them. And stormwater is probably the #1 issue when it comes to water quality. And stormwater discharges can cause a lot of issues for the trout. So similar to before, we have a buffer restoration program that we're doing. So actually tomorrow, the yard on the left you see, we'll be planting that tomorrow. So we've been working with that homeowner along Brook, who has yard basically extends directly to the brook. We'll be working with them to plant trees and shrubs all along that bank to increase the shade and cover on that water. And it's a little hard to see, but on the right, we have an area by Pine Tree Brook that was taken over by Phragmites. We treated that area, so all those stems that you see there are dead Phragmites. And we are soon going to be replanting that on Saturday with the help of Greater Boston Trout Unlimited. Their volunteers are going to be out there helping to replant that area with native species so that we can maintain shade over the water, but also have a healthy forest system that's not just overrun by invasive Phragmites.
Chris, we're going to try to switch to Q&A in about 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll speed up then. Sorry. So one of the ways that we've dealt with stormwater and trying to make sure that pollutants aren't being discharged to our streams, we've been working with our towns through the Neponset Stormwater Partnership to build these types of stormwater management structures you see here. These things accept stormwater and soak it into the ground before it actually reaches the brook. And in some cases actually recharge groundwater, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So as I alluded to before, trout really need cold spring water, which means they need groundwater essentially. And the groundwater sources that the fish are relying on are oftentimes the same groundwater sources that municipalities are using for their drinking water wells. And so that obviously puts a conflict between people and the fish. And in addition to that, if you think of
if it doesn't want to just
more droughts in the future, you have that conflict is just going to increase through time. So one of the things NepRWA is doing, or some of the things that NepRWA is doing, is really advocating for sustainable water use in the watershed. So we're really pushing for towns to start using NepRWA water, which comes from the Quabbin, rather than local sources during the summer when stream flows are lowest, when pressure is the highest, when outdoor water use is the highest. We have a water conservation program where we meet with 5th grade students all over the watershed and teach them about the importance of conserving water and what they can do at home. And then we've also been working with our towns to offer rebate programs for people to basically get a discount on buying high efficiency washers and toilets and things like that that use much less water, so that there's more water left over for the fish. I apologize that I'm flying through things now, but I'm running out of time. And I just want to close by talking about this really cool study that we're doing right now with Greater Boston Trout Unlimited. We're working with Greater Boston Trout Unlimited and the University of Maine to basically assess what's going on in our cold water streams. A lot of what we're talking about is kind of theoretical, and this actually provides the data for us to track what our progress is and see what the impacts of all these efforts are. So one of the things that we're doing, one of the tools that we're using is called environmental DNA, which is a really cool new practice where you use a unique sequence in DNA to detect the presence of whatever you're looking for. And so in this instance, we're looking for brook trout and brown trout. And so we broke up our streams into 1 kilometer sections, and we've collected water samples in August. And I was really hoping to have results to present today, but unfortunately we haven't gotten results back from the lab. But keep your eyes peeled for that information coming up on our website. And then in addition to that, like I said, water temperature is really important for trout. We deployed temperature loggers all throughout the watershed to find out, where are the sections that are still staying cold for brook trout, where are the sections that are getting too hot, and where are the sections that are kind of right at the border that we need to really be thinking about what actions we can take to push it towards colder water rather than towards warming. And so that's kind of the last slide here, which is the next step. So we're going to take all of that information that we've gathered about the culverts and the dams that are in the watershed. We're going to combine that with the information that we're getting through the Embrace Stream program, and we're going to really look at these questions, these key questions, to come up with plans for each individual watershed. Each one has unique challenges, each one has a unique makeup, and really dive down to see what do we need to do in each of these streams in order to make them sustainable for trout. And so with that, I'll end it. I just want to thank all of the partners and funders who've made this initiative possible, and we can switch over to question and answer.
Thanks so much, Chris. I just want to take a moment to again thank Clay Subaru of Norwood. They helped make this Watershed Wednesday program possible. So thank you, Clay Subaru. I'm going to read a few of the questions. If people have additional questions, they can put them in the chat. Susan is wondering about alewife and if they are related to the fish that you're discussing.
So alewife are a type of herring. They are primarily saltwater fish, but they do come up into rivers to spawn. Unfortunately, they don't spawn in the Neponset any longer. The Baker Dam prevents any fish from coming up from the ocean, except for eels. Somehow eels have found a way to get over dams, which I don't think anybody really knows how they do it. But yeah, alewife, we would love to restore alewife spawning in the Neponset, but unfortunately it no longer happens.
Thanks, Chris. Perry had a question. Could you comment on PCBs in the Neponset and fish?
Sure.
How does PCB cleanup coordinate with dam removal?
Yeah, excellent. Both of those questions kind of fit together really nicely. So PCBs are a contamination from old industrial uses of the river. They were a byproduct of electronics manufacturing largely. And they are one of those types of chemicals that don't really degrade in environments. So unfortunately, there are areas in the Neponset where the sediments have accumulated high levels of PCBs. And the PCBs become an issue because they accumulate within fish tissue. So the fish are eating the small bugs that live in the mud, and they get PCBs through that, and then bigger fish eat the smaller fish, and those PCBs accumulate in there, and they work their way up the food chain. So the biggest threat to people from those PCBs is really if you're eating fish out of the river. So there are specific guidelines that Mass Health gives that say, I think it's no more than 2 fish, don't quote me on this, it's something along the lines of no more than 2 fish a month unless you're pregnant or below the age of 13. I generally say just don't eat fish out of the Neponset River, quite frankly. It's not worth the risk, I don't think. But it does relate to dam removal because we've long been in discussions about removing parts of the, removing the T&H dam and removing parts of the Baker Dam in order to restore those historic herring and alewife runs. But one of the big things that's holding that back is the PCBs. You know, we need to clean those up because they've accumulated behind the dams. We need to clean those up before we can restore that fish passage. And that's a very expensive proposition. The PCBs have to be dewatered and hauled to a very specific place for hazardous waste. And that's really kind of what's been holding things up. Right now, EPA is looking at Superfund as a possibility of a means of cleaning those things up, but that's still in discussion phases right now.
Thanks, Chris. Another question from James is, are predator populations deemed to have an effect on the trout population?
Yes, that is a possibility. So predators of brook trout are largely smallmouth bass and brown trout, and then other larger brook trout. In our watershed, we don't really have very much smallmouth bass, so that's not really an issue. But historically, brown trout have been stocked by the state. Brown trout are native to Europe, not this area, but they have hung around. They've been able to reproduce. They're slightly less sensitive to some of the issues that brook trout are sensitive to, particularly temperature. And they have been known to predate on brook trout. I don't have specific data or information about, you know, predation rates in our watershed per se, but that is generally an issue that people look at.
Thanks, Chris. Edmund had a question. Can you discuss the problem and impacts of stocking by the state? It's kind of related to what you just talked about.
Interesting, yeah. So that's one issue. And then another issue with stocking is sometimes, so people who have done genetic studies of brook trout have found that actually some of the brook trout populations that are in each individual stream are very closely related, as if they're not really leaving the stream where they were born. And because of that, those populations are very adapted to the conditions of that stream. And when you stock over top of native populations, so if you stock brook trout from a nursery into a stream with native brook trout, that can affect the genetics of that population and have a lot of issues with, you know, how well they stay adapted to the conditions of the stream that they're native to. Also, as I mentioned, larger brook trout are known to eat smaller brook trout. And when you're stocking fish, you're typically putting larger fish into those water bodies, which can then, you know, have issues of predation of the native fish, and you get kind of a replacement of those native brook trout.
Thanks, Chris. It's a little after 1, so we're going to keep going with questions, but I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for attending the event today, and let you know that we have 2 more Watershed Wednesday events scheduled, one on November 18th about stormwater, and one on December 16th about the Mattapan Food and Fitness Coalition. So thanks again for coming. We're going to keep going through questions, but if you have to go, that's okay. Chris, another question from John is the eDNA data qualitative or quantitative?
It's
as in present or absent?
Right, exactly, yeah. So it's qualitative, it's presence or absence. They do have a capability of quantifying or estimating the size of a population based on the concentration or the amount of DNA that they found. But that's a completely different and more expensive method than what we're doing. We're simply looking for presence and absence at this point.
Great. A question from D is, do you have a count on the amount of trout currently in Pine Tree and Trap Hole? How many trout can thrive in these small streams?
Yeah, so the only information we have about the numbers of trout is based on the state's records. So if we go back to this slide here, you can see this. So basically each of these dots represents a time that state staff went and electroshocked the system. So they did a full survey of the area. And so you can see some of those points are pretty big, 60 to 118 at one location. So they are capable of supporting up to over 100 fish in some instances, but most of the populations in the watershed are much smaller than that. You can still see the slides, right?
Yep.
Okay, good.
A question from Steven is, how safe is the Neponset Reservoir in Foxborough? I'm not sure if that's related to fish or people, but.
In terms of eating fish, there are other issues in the reservoir, cadmium being the largest issue, which would affect, how edible fish are. But generally for recreation, if you're swimming, boating, etc., it's perfectly fine. With the caveat that I recommend not swimming in any natural water body for at least 48 hours after a rainstorm, because that storm water is washing everything off the streets into the nearest water body. In a lot of cases, that means a lot of bacteria from pet waste and wildlife waste. So as a rule of thumb, I would say don't swim in any natural water body for at least 48 hours. But generally speaking, most of the time, the reservoir is perfectly safe for recreation.
Paul asked, what kinds of remediation can be done in places where a storm drain empties into a trout stream?
Yeah, so a lot of times what you do in that situation is you try to get the water before it gets to the stream. So you can do things like what we've done with the Neponset Stormwater Partnership, where you can build rain gardens or what's called bioretention cells. They're basically holes that you dig in the ground and you redirect water out of a pipe into that hole so it can soak into the ground, soak through the soil, get filtered through that soil, and go there rather than going to the stream where it's going to impact the fish.
Thanks, Chris. A question from Jean. Are rainbow trout, and please explain the photo behind you.
Rainbow trout are trout. They're native to the West Coast, but they do stock them locally. In the Neponset Watershed, Massapog Lake, or Willett Pond, I believe, or I'm sorry, not Willett Pond, Buckmaster Pond, and I'm trying to think. There's one other place where they stock rainbow trout. They typically don't survive the summer, so they're not really an issue when you think about competing with other species. But they do stock them in the watershed. And the picture behind me is actually two spawning trout. If you notice, I hope I'm out of the way. If you notice, the one trout in the foreground has a little pebble in its mouth. So these are two trout that are building a redd. They're building their nest where they're going to lay their eggs.
Another question from Edmund. Do PCBs, etc., make eating trout unsafe? And does it make the stream catch and release?
Yes, so the trout aren't typically in the areas where the PCBs are found. The PCBs are mainly concentrated in the lower portions of the river between Milton and Boston, really starting at Mother Brook and extending to the Baker Dam. So those areas don't typically have brook trout in them. But I would say because of how fragile these populations of brook trout are, that if you are fishing these areas, they should be catch and release only. But that said, there are other areas in the watershed where PCBs are found. So I can't say definitively one way or the other if the trout are impacted, but I think it's pretty unlikely that the trout are severely impacted by the PCBs. But again, I don't advocate eating any trout out of the river.
I think the last question I see here in the chat is, will volunteers be involved in removing the dams?
So in the past, we've had volunteers help out with dam removals. Two of the dams that we're working on now are a bit beyond volunteer ability. They're really going to require pretty heavy machinery and things like that. But there may be other opportunities for volunteers related to dam removal. For instance, that Phragmites patch was one of our conditions for removing a dam in Milton was we needed to treat the nearby Phragmites. So that opportunity kind of directly resulted out of the removal of that dam. But in the near term, I think that our dam removals are going to be a little bit beyond what our volunteers can do.
All right, thanks so much, Chris. I think that brings us to the end of the Watershed Wednesdays talk. Thanks for all of the interesting information, and thanks for everyone who was able to attend. We hope to see you again soon. And if you're interested in learning more about NepRWA or about the Trout program, you can check out our website at neponset.org. Thank you.